We are all natural-born storytellers, whether you think of yourself that way or not. The stories that mold and shape our lives oftentimes become foundational parts of our growth, healing, and even generational experiences. Welcome to Awaken Your Soul Sunday, a storytelling series that shares the moments of awakening, trials and tribulations, truth, and vulnerability in the words and voice of the featured storyteller. And now, a life-changing story from this week's guest.
My name is Melissa Llarena. I'm 41, and I'm a New Yorker based in Sydney, Australia. A mom to 3 sons, 2 of which are identical twins. And the odds of having those identical twins was about 1 out of 200. Now, I grew up in a 650 square foot apartment in Astoria, Queens, New York. Back then, my mom was paid at most $15 an hour back in the 90s. And I remember I had an aunt, still do, who has been on public assistance since I was a little girl. Around me, I would not see many individuals who had gotten that ultimate paper college degree. To say that I felt as if I had no mentors is an understatement. I felt like I didn't know important people. That made me feel unimportant. And I remember my parents got divorced, my dad remarried, and I would visit his wife's travel agency. Imagine a tiny little girl, curly hair, chubby around the cheeks, visiting this building that was owned by someone she knew. That was really foreign to me. It was her family's business. And I remember looking around her dad's office with the wood panel walls and seeing photos of him shaking the hands of really important people, from sports figures to politicians to movie stars. And that commanded respect in my eyes, the eyes of a little girl who at the time felt unimportant. And I remember when I would go back home every other weekend to be in that 650 square foot apartment, I would really try to see if there was someone in my family lineage who I could look up to. But it was really hard to find anyone. And I remember being little, but knowing that I needed to have big ambitions, quite possibly bigger than I could even imagine myself fulfilling at any point in my life. And for me, of course, back in the 80s and 90s, I got the idea that I would go to law school. I would go to law school and I would have a home in Connecticut and I'd have a housekeeper and he'd be a guy. And of course, that's reminiscent of Who's the Boss from the 1980s with Tony Maselli and Angela Bauer. And those were my mentors. It was Angela Bauer, Tony Maselli, Who's the Boss. And I remember that I wanted to feel important. I wanted to go as far as I could in my education, and I made it my business to defy those odds. And I attended law school. I went for 1 whole semester, and then I quit. I quit, and at the time, I felt like the ultimate failure. And I felt like a liar. I had told everyone around me that I would be one of the first in my family to go to law school, but I couldn't do it. It felt disingenuous to who I was, and quite frankly, it was hard and it was really boring. So I went on a quest. I went on a quest to interview anyone who I thought was interesting, anyone who I thought was important, anyone who was in a career I could admire. And at the time, I didn't realize that that was a clue into what I would be doing today. And it would actually help me rethink what I would want to contribute to the world at this point by way of my talents. And that was the spark that I needed to ultimately launch my own podcast. Now, you've got to recall, I'm a mom with 3 little children. And I remember one evening I was cooking rice and beans over the stove, and all of a sudden my husband comes into the kitchen and he's just so excited. He told me back in 2017 that James Altucher, a podcaster, had been interviewing Gary Vaynerchuk, a podcaster. And he told me, as I was stirring the beans, mindfully trying to not burn dinner, that if I launched a podcast, not only would Gary V promise to be on that podcast, but so would James Altucher. And that was it for me. I knew that when presented with a dare, even if I had all these responsibilities of motherhood, even if I had no clue how to record an audio recording, I was game. I was game. And in that moment over the stove, I just remember this insane sense of responsibility overwhelming me and just filling me up. And it was that moment when I realized that what I needed to do, what I needed to be, what I needed in my life was to become the mentor that I never had, to become that person who I had seen as a little girl on the walls in my stepmother's dad's office, who was shaking the hands of really important people. And because of that fire in my belly, I set out to do what felt back then to be fairly impossible. I tried my best to get the attention of Gary V. It was not a simple request. I tried my best to get the attention of James Altucher. It was not a simple request. And I remember thinking to myself, I need to find a way to distinguish myself. And so I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote. I wrote 1,000 words for about 100 days, but when I counted it, I ended up writing 67,000 words to get the attention of both men to appear on my podcast. It was that important to me to be a mentor and to have access to the mentors I never had, so that my 3 little boys would have a treasure trove of stories to take and use for their own life experiences. And I did it. I was one of the only people to have both Gary V as episode number 10, and I visited James Altucher, and he was my episode number 5. And I'm so proud of that moment. But when I think about what it took in order to feel important and what it took in order to feel like I mattered, that entire experience taught me this one huge concept, which is it doesn't matter what other people think of you, and it doesn't matter who's in your circles in order for you to feel like you have value. There's this intrinsic value that I had never learned, neither from my mom, from my aunts, from my dad, from anyone around me. And it's this intrinsic value that I hope to give to my little boys. And it's now that I can definitely say that I feel like that mentor that I never had.
For more information on this week's guest, visit the episode notes section on mindbizlife.com. And if you'd like to share your story with us, click on the Awaken Your Soul tab on mindbizlife.com and fill out the submission form. Don't forget to share this episode with a friend, and be sure to give the podcast a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever it is that you tune in and turn it up. Join me on Wednesday for more life mastery conversations. But until then, remember, every level of life is an opportunity to grow. Be well, my friend.